Well, welcome everyone, and good evening to all of you. And we're happy to have you along on this special episode on Toronto apologetics. My name is Tony Costa, and we're very glad to have you along. Toronto apologetics is dedicated to the defense and proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and we are here to give reasons for faith, to address controversial topics that challenge the historic Christian faith. And so tonight we're going to be dealing with a very, very important topic. Just want to remind you folks again, if you would like to subscribe to the channel, it's absolutely free. And we also encourage you to like the video as well. So tonight we're going to be dealing with a very important topic, a topic where Christians have gone back and forth, and there's been confusion in this area as well. And that has to do with the relationship of the New Testament believer to the law. That is to say, the law of Moses in the Old Testament. And how much of that law do we keep? Do we observe all of it? Do we only observe the moral law? And what about the ceremonial law and the civic law? Are these laws abrogated by Christ, and so we're only under the moral law? And how does the Ten Commandments factor into this as well? So tonight I'm very blessed and very happy to have my dear brother and dear friend in Messiah Jesus, Fruchtenbaum. Arnold, welcome to the program. It's such a delight to have you.
It's my pleasure.
So maybe, Arnold, if you can just say a little bit about your ministry. You are the director, president, I believe, of Ariel Ministries. Maybe you could say a little bit about that ministry.
The word Ariel is a Hebrew word meaning the Lion of God. So we are Jews who believe in the Messiahship of Yeshua, Messiahship of Jesus, whom the Bible calls the Lion of the tribe of Judah. We have a twofold purpose. First of all, to share the gospel with our own Jewish people. We have branches now in 13 or so different countries, and we do a lot of the frontline evangelism in these different countries, not in all of them, because in some countries there's a lack of a Jewish population, but when there is a Jewish population, we reach out to them. But second thing, we have a very important thing that we do is to teach the scriptures from a Jewish frame of reference, meaning the Jewish background out of which the Bible was written. And mostly this comes from a Jewish perspective. Sadly, most Christian schools, with 2 or 3 exceptions, there's no Jewish studies department in them. So people are not exposed to it. So we're not saying what they're teaching is wrong, we're just saying what they're not teaching enough. It's just not as deep as it should be. And so we have an educational program in all our branches that can do the teaching from a Jewish perspective. We have a special summer school program that begins the first Saturday in July and continues for 2.5 months up until just past the Labor Day weekend, American Labor Day weekend, into September. And we're looking forward to our program, which will start in about a month and a half from now, and so on. And that's our whole purpose here. We also publish pamphlets and manuscripts and books on a variety of different topics all relevant to Messianic Jewish studies and so on. So that's essentially what we are.
Yeah, and I really appreciate your work, Arnold. I know the first time I met you, you were in Canada at the Markham Bible Chapel, and so I think I came twice. I think you were up there a couple of times, and that's where I first got to meet you with my wife. And you told me that my wife looked Jewish, and she does. And I take that as a compliment. And I was really riveted by your teaching, Arnold. You were talking about the life of the Messiah as you were going through the gospel accounts, and I was tremendously blessed. And folks, if you have a passion, and you should have a passion for the Jewish people, Romans 1:16, the gospel is the power of God unto salvation to the Jew first, and then to the Greek, to the Gentiles. And so I would encourage you to visit Dr. Fruchtenbaum's website, ariel.org. There's a lot of wonderful resources there, and Dr. Fruchtenbaum has authored a number of books. One of my favorite is Messianic Christology, and I know Dr. Fruchtenbaum has written a book called Israelology. I think that was your doctoral dissertation at New York University. Dr. Fruchtenbaum is one of the leading Messianic Jewish scholars in the world today, and so I would really encourage you to avail yourself of that. And maybe Arnold, if you could maybe share a little bit about. I understand your background was you're a Russian Jew. Can you say a little bit about how you came to faith in Yeshua as the Mashiach of Israel? Maybe you can share that with our hearers.
Just small correction. I was born in Russia, but we are Polish Jews, not Russian
Oh,
Jews.
okay,
My
okay.
father fled from Hitler into Russia, and he got arrested for illegal crossing. Although he was Jewish, they accused him of being a Nazi spy and shipped him out to a concentration camp in Siberia. He labored for 2 years of hard labor in Siberia. And then when Hitler attacked Russia, the Russian government was in need of the political support of the Polish government exiled in England. And the government in England, exiled from Poland, agreed, but they laid down certain conditions, one of which the release of all Polish citizens. My father got released, but he stayed in Siberia because of the war on the European side of Russia. There, in the course of different events, we met my mother. My mother first met him. She wanted to get a picture taken for passport situations. So she got a picture taken, and I developed. So I was born in Siberia, Russia, but our language at home was Polish and Yiddish, not Russian. Anyway, we came back to Poland legally because Poland had become a communist country. Then, because of a Passover riot, we escaped from Poland, walked through Czechoslovakia. At that point, there was one country. And then we crossed into Austria. And then the American MPs took over and brought us into the American zone of West Germany. And that's where a pastor met with my parents, who was representing a Jewish ministry based in New York City. He gave out clothing primarily to Jewish refugees, which we were. Anyway, they met several times, and when he discovered we had the immigration papers, we were requesting immigration papers to the USA. Happened to have a magazine called The Chosen People, published by a Jewish ministry in New York City. So mother never knew what it was because he didn't give her the magazine. He just tore off the cover, which had the New York headquarters address. And so after 5 years in West Germany in about 7 different camps, displaced persons camps, we got immigration papers. We moved to Brooklyn, New York. That's where I was contacted with that same Jewish ministry. And in the course of different events with them, I became a believer in Brooklyn, New York as a result of their ministry.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. And since then, you've been serving the Lord speaking about the New Testament from a Jewish perspective and understanding the life of Jesus, Yeshua, the way we say Jesus in Hebrew. And your ministry has been to go to various churches around the world and to educate them on the importance of understanding the New Testament from a Jewish framework.
Yeah, includes churches, also different Messianic congregations. Like I said, we have an 8-week summer school program in upstate New York in the Adirondacks, near the Canadian border, by the way.
Mm.
And then we have a 2-week curriculum followed by a 3-week curriculum. Then the 6th week, we spent that whole week to teach the long version of the Life of Messiah, the 25-hour version with 3 hours in the morning, 2 hours at night. Do another 2-week curriculum, and then finally Labor Day weekend curriculum. And so that's the basic program, so people can come for all 8 weeks. They can come for 2 or 3 weeks, depending how much free time they have. And by looking at our webpage, ariel.org, and looking at the Shoshana Campus button, they'll give you the full program for this summer.
Right. And everyone, just to let you know, all that information is in the description box. So if you want to learn more about Ariel.org and Ariel Ministries and Dr. Fruchtenbaum's ministry, I would encourage you to go to the description box, click on the link there, and it'll take you right into their website. So Arnold, tonight we wanted to talk about the relationship of the law of Moses and the law of Messiah, or the law of Christ. This is a source of great controversy because there's various camps within the Christian church that would say that that we are still under the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, that we are still under the moral law. And they would argue that the Sabbath was a creation ordinance and that the Sabbath turned into Sunday. And then you've got groups that have emerged, cults like the Hebrew Roots movement and many others that have said that Christians should be observing the whole Torah, all the aspects of the Mosaic law. So maybe at first, Arnold, maybe you could say a little bit about when we talk about the law of Moses, what are we referring to specifically?
By way of introduction, let me point out the Bible has 7 different law codes. It's not just those 2. You had the Adamic law code before the fall of man, then the Adamic law code, then the Noahic law code, then you had the Abrahamic law code, you had the Mosaic law code, you also had the law of the Messiah, the law of Christ, and then in the future we'll have kingdom law. You should compare going from one law code to another. 3 things always happen. First of all, certain laws are repeated. Secondly, certain laws are discontinued. And thirdly, certain laws are brand new, never seen before. So that's how you know when you're moving from one age to another. So for example, let's take the issue of eating. The law code from the Adamic and even the Adamic covenant was all man was to be vegetarian. Mm-hmm. Only in the Noahic covenant could they eat meats and no limitations. Every moving thing shall be food for you, says Genesis 9. And on top of that, that continued for the Gentiles, but with the rise of Moses, then Jews were limited to what they can eat. So in land animals, this you can eat, this you cannot eat. Birds, this you can eat, not eat. Seafood, this you can eat, this you can eat, this you cannot eat. Insects, this you can eat, this you cannot eat. And so that was limited to the Jews, while the Gentiles still operated under the Adamic and Noahic covenants. So you have these different law codes, so it's not just these 2. And the law of Moses was not given to the world. There's several times it specifies was given specifically to the people of Israel. And a place like Exodus 19, the same people that God rescued out of Egypt. And he didn't rescue the Seventh-day Adventist Church out of Egypt. He rescued the Jewish people out of Egypt, and that's the key should be remembered. And so, but the main 2 law codes that have been operative is, first of all, the Mosaic law code from the time God gave that law in Mount Sinai. And then that was to continue until not the coming of the Messiah, but rather till the death of the Messiah. Until he died, all 613 commandments were applicable and mandatory for Jews only. And what's the issue then becomes what happens with his death. And again, a new law code is introduced. Certain commandments are repeated, like 9 of the 10 commandments are repeated. The one not repeated is the Sabbath commandment. Then other laws are brand new, never seen before. And some laws are merely intensified. So now under a new law code, and only laws of the Mosaic laws that we are required to follow are the laws he actually repeats in the law of the Messiah. Other laws, either we are free to observe them, we're not required to observe them. Other laws, if we choose to observe them, they'll violate the law of the Messiah. Let me take the issue of eating of Passover. The law of Moses says you cannot invite any Gentile to the Passover table until he's been circumcised first. So you have to check that out. Well, thank God I don't have to check that out anymore. I don't want to see if they're circumcised or not. I can invite any Gentile to my Passover table whether they're circumcised or not. But if somebody says you have to be circumcised before you can eat at this table, he's now violating the law of the Messiah. He's keeping the law of Moses he's keeping, but it's not operable. And so if he keeps that Mosaic commandment, therefore he is violating the law of the Messiah. And what people often think in the terms of the Sabbath, that's when you have your corporate worship. But simply put, Moses never said even once to gather together for corporate worship every Sabbath. Carpet was allowed only with the tabernacle where the temple stood. So it began once they crossed into the promised land at Shiloh, but ultimately became Jerusalem. So if you lived in Galilee, it's a 3-day walk to Jerusalem. So pay the Galilean Jew, if you had to have Sabbath worship every Sabbath, he had to spend 3 days walking up to Jerusalem, have the Sabbath service, and go then spend 3 days walking back to the Galilee. He finally gets home. He kisses his wife hello, but he has to kiss her goodbye and make a U-turn, head back to Jerusalem to get to observe the next Sabbath. He would not be working for 6 days, only walking for 6 days to observe the Sabbath. And so cup worshippers in the Mosaic law required only 3 times a year. The Feast of the Passover, the Feast of Weeks became known as Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. But the Sabbath was not a day of corporate worship, it was the day to stay home and rest, meditate upon the things of God and things of that nature. It was not any official day of corporate worship. Mosaic law also said on the Sabbath you cannot ride anything. You can't ride your donkey, you can't ride your horse, and so on. So people who claim to keep the Sabbath, not just Seventh-day Adventists, but in certain Messianic circles, when they get into the car and they start the engine, they just broke the Sabbath. They drive to the congregation, they broke the Sabbath again. And then they fix up some refreshments and put the stove on, again they broke the Sabbath. Then they start their car to drive home, and they broke the Sabbath again. So on that day, they break Sabbath law after Sabbath law after Sabbath law, not keeping the Sabbath biblically. Only and that's I think it's just misconstrued on what it means to keep the Sabbath. Simply staying home and resting, not traveling. So you have all of these many examples that they actually think they're keeping Torah, but they're breaking Torah on a regular basis because they don't look at the details. What did Moses say about these laws, and what did he say about the proper way of keeping them? And if you use that criteria, you notice how often you don't keep the Sabbath. Even worse, you keep breaking the Sabbath. And that's the problem these different groups have, and they need to stick with the text of Scripture and not follow certain traditions, be they Jewish traditions or Christian or Gentile traditions. They're both just traditions. And sometimes traditions actually violate the Torah, the law of Moses, or the law of the Messiah.
Right. And so you make a good point there about the Sabbath originally was meant to be just stay at home and rest and meditate on the things of God. And the only ones who were actually working, the priests, had to work. They had to take animals, and they had to slit their throats. They had to sacrifice them. And even Yeshua, Jesus, admitted that when he said that the priests work on the Sabbath and they're guiltless, they're not condemned.
Right.
And that's because they're involved in divine service. But what is interesting is even the 3 main feasts, the Pentecost and Passover and Tabernacles, they had to appear before the Lord in Jerusalem, in the designated place that he had called. And so what you're saying, Arnold, is that even today, when our Jewish friends gather together for the Passover, whether it's in Brooklyn or in Toronto or in Paris or London, they're supposed to be in Jerusalem according to the Torah. Am I correct?
That's exactly right. And if they're observing the Passover outside of Jerusalem, then they are breaking the Torah. Even if they live in Israel, but they observe it not in Jerusalem specifically, they're breaking the Torah. And that's exactly correct. And that's what they need to understand. Furthermore, even most Messianic Jews, when they serve the Passover, then they generally follow the rule. They never serve lamb. They serve chicken, or they serve beef, but they don't serve lamb. Now, when we do the Passover under Ariel Ministries, we're doing it not to fulfill the Torah, we're just doing it as a remembrance. So we do the Passover with its traditional customs, as long as they don't violate the New Testament. And then we follow all of the normal procedures. We have a special, what we call the Haggadah for Messianic Jews, and so on. And we're following the law of the Messiah. We're free to observe it. We're free not to observe it. And so we don't claim that we are fulfilling the Torah because we're not doing it in Jerusalem, but we are not doing it the way we should be doing it and where we should be doing it. And furthermore, at our Seder's Passover dinners, we serve lamb. We don't serve chicken. We don't serve turkey. We don't serve anything else because we want to bring God clearly. He's called the Lamb of God. He was never called the chicken of God. And so, I mean, why keep following certain rabbinic traditions that post AD 70 when you don't follow the scriptures? So again, when we have our Sabbath services, our congregations, we're not claiming to keep the Sabbath. We're using our lip body, the Messiah, to hold our services on Shabbat, on the Sabbath. And we keep the Passover. We want to make sure people understand what the meaning is, not just deliverance from Egypt, but also Messiah, our Passover sacrifice. And therefore, we follow those elements, but we're doing it out of choice, not out of being mandated to keep it. And on top of that, we always make sure that the symbolism is not missed. And the key symbol is lamb. People may not like lamb, but this is a ceremonial issue. And they can go ahead and add chicken and beef if they want to, but it should not be in place of the lamb. It should be in addition to the lamb.
Right. Right. And so Arnold, a lot of Christians are probably listening to this, and they're probably thinking, well, what is the relevance of the law in the Old Testament? What is the relevance of the law and all those legislations that God gave to Moses? And you usually hear a lot of folks say, are you saying that it's okay to commit adultery? Are you saying it's okay to murder? And the Ten Commandments clearly forbids murder and adultery and lying and dishonoring parents and so forth and so on. And unfortunately, a lot of folks think that way, and they assume that you and I are being antinomian, that we are against the law of God. Maybe you can clarify that, because I think a lot of folks assume that when we talk about the law of Christ, which is a New Testament description, when we talk about the law of Messiah, the law of Christ, a lot of folks seem to think that the Decalogue, the tablets of the law, they seem to think that they're still enforced, and particularly among our Reformed brethren, that Decalogue has not been abrogated. Maybe you can talk towards that, because the idea of the Ten Commandments, for a lot of folks, is this: it's still there, and we should still be observing it today.
Well, the initial mistake that they make is to separate the Ten Commandments from the other 603 commandments. But the Mosaic law is not 10 commandments, it's 613 commandments. And they have different categories, but the Bible never divides them in those same categories, as often theology separates them. And it's always viewed as a unit. Both in Hebrew, the word Torah is singular, and in Greek, nomos, the book is the word is singular. But that singular stands for not 10 commandments, but 613 commandments. And furthermore, 9 of those 10 commandments people like repeated in the law of the Messiah. The one that is not repeated is the Sabbath commandment. What often in Reformed theology or covenantal theology and replacement theology, they transfer the word Shabbat, Sabbath, to Sunday. You won't find a single example of that. Not even once. The Sabbath is always sundown Friday till sundown Saturday. Saturday night is still Saturday, but it's not the Sabbath anymore. It ends with the sundown. And in practice, once you can see 3 stars, the Sabbaths come to an end. And so on. So you cannot really apply to Sunday. What the Bible does require is regular corporate services. It never says to meet on the first day of the week. Now, it's true that it's mentioned. However, the first day of the week doesn't start Sunday morning. And in Gentile churches, as we know from 2nd century documents, the Gentiles were meeting on Sunday morning, but the Jewish congregations didn't wait till Sunday morning because that was a work day. So, like in chapter 20, verse 7 of Acts, they met in the evening on the first day of the week. That's not Sunday morning. It's the evening. They had the lamps going, the candles going, and so on, because it was over the evening and the Sabbath had come to an end. The first day of the week begins sundown Saturday, not Sunday a.m. And that's got to be understood clearly. The Jewish congregations met Saturday evening because Sunday morning was a work day. In Israel today, Sunday morning is a work day, and so on. So it's easier for congregations in Israel to meet on Shabbat, Friday night, or Saturday morning. But the day of the week is not actually mandated. You're free to, as a congregation, to meet any day of the week. So if the elders of your congregation or your church decide from now on you'll meet only on Tuesdays and become Third-day Adventists, that's fine. You're meeting regularly. That's what fulfills the biblical requirement. But day of the week is nowhere mandated anywhere. So just as they often accuse us Jews of following tradition and not rules, Gentile churches have done the same thing. They're following traditions and not what the Bible actually states. But biblically, Gentile churches, when they meet on Sunday, they're free to do so. Churches, usually in Muslim countries, meet on Friday, just the one day off they have from working. And among Jews, in most cases, we have our services Friday night or Saturday morning or on both, and so on. So they got to have a distinction there. But the Torah is not 10 commandments. It's all 613 commandments. And a few years ago, when I was teaching in Australia, there was a Seventh-day Adventist guy there, very strong. And he pulled me aside and says, what I don't understand is why we have a number of Messianic Jews here in Sydney, and and virtually none of them joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church. That makes no sense. So I told him, because you're keeping the Sabbath is only what the lady wrote about seeing a vision of the Ten Commandments and God drawing a circle around the Sabbath commandment. Then you guys totally ignore when Moses tells you the proper way to keep the Sabbath. The Sabbath did not begin with Adam. And from Genesis, in the book of Genesis, from Adam unto Moses in Exodus, there's no record of anybody keeping the Sabbath. The Sabbath was given uniquely to the Jewish people, like the law of Moses was given, and not repeated in the law of the Messiah. So our congregations meet on Shabbat. We're not saying we're observing the Torah. We're not, because we're breaking the Torah when we drive to our congregational meeting. That's not keeping the Torah. That's breaking it. We're not allowed to drive. No Orthodox Jew drives to the synagogue on the Sabbath. They know how to keep the Sabbath. But the Seventh-day Adventists think they're keeping the Sabbath, but they're not. They're breaking it over and over and over again. And so that's the kind of thing you have to understand. And so again, you have to remember the three principles. Some commandments are repeated, some commandments are discontinued, and some commandments are brand new, never seen before. That's when you enter a new age, a new period of time. It's a new law code, and that's what it goes by.
Right.
And that's the thing to keep distinct.
Yeah, and so I think it's fair to say that to our Christian viewers, that the reason why we don't commit adultery is not because Moses said don't commit adultery, but because the law of Christ says do not commit adultery. So, so those moral laws that have come into the new covenant, into the New Testament, into the law of Christ, so prohibitions against sexual immorality, idolatry, blasphemy, and so forth. These moral laws are enforced because they're in the law of Christ.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so when we have all those sin lists that Paul mentions, 1 Corinthians 6, all these sins, and then in Romans he mentions all these violations and sins. It's interesting, when I debated a Seventh-day Adventist here, Arnold, a couple of years ago in Toronto, one of the things I asked him was, in all the sin lists we have in the New Testament, is there anything said about Sabbath breaking? The Apostle Paul says nothing about Gentiles being guilty for breaking the Sabbath, but they are guilty for adultery, for murder, for idolatry, for blasphemy, and so forth and so on. And so I think it's important that our viewers understand that 9 of the 10 commandments are ratified in the New Covenant. And can you explain why, Arnold, why the Sabbath, in particular, why that 4th commandment is not repeated in the New Covenant?
Well, different issues become signs of specific covenants. The rainbow is the sign of the Noahic covenant, for example, and circumcision was the sign for the Abrahamic covenant. But for the Mosaic covenant, the Sabbath is the sign. If you look at all the Sabbath passages within the Torah, within the 4 of the 5 books of Moses, you're emphasizing the Torah, the Sabbath was mandated for Jews only. And because the sign of the Mosaic covenant, and because the Torah Moshe, meaning the law of Moses, came to an end with Messiah's death, not when he was living. When Jesus says they must keep all of these commandments, when he says all of these commandments, he didn't mean just 10. He means 613. And but the law did not end with his coming. It ended with his death. Death is the marking point As you move from the law of Moses to the law of the Messiah, that's when the new law code comes in. And because particularly Sabbath was a sign of the Mosaic covenant, the Mosaic covenant ceased to be the mandatory rule of life. That's when the Sabbath became no longer was an issue. And that's why we who are biblically oriented, who are both Messianic and non-Messianic, that we understand that when we have our corporate services, whether it's on Sunday or as we have it on the Sabbath, we're not keeping the Torah. We're breaking it, but we're not practicing the Torah. We're practicing the Torah Moshe, the law of the Messiah. And that should be kept in mind. That is our rule of life. And so, yes, we have to put fornication, homosexuality, all these other issues, but those issues are all repeated in the law of the Messiah. And the reason we don't need to keep the Sabbath, that's not repeated. Now, we're free to keep the Sabbath. We're not mandated to keep the Sabbath. But we say we have to keep the Sabbath, and you have to keep the Sabbath as Moses said. And guess what? As soon as you drive your car or take a bus to your church service, you just broke the Sabbath. That's not the way Moses said to keep the Sabbath. So people have to be conscious. They're dealing with a different law code, but all law codes, again, repeated certain commandments, discontinued certain commandments, and brand new commandments. For example, the most important commandment Yeshua or Jesus told us is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and so on in Deuteronomy 6. And the second most important commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. Neither one is among the 10 commandments. Neither one.
Mm-hmm.
So, but he said the two most important commandments were not among the 10 commandments. So that's why we have to be conscious. The 10 commandments were just given like a Bill of Rights in the American Constitution. In addition to the American Constitution, the individual Bill of Rights.
Mm-hmm.
It's not contradicting the Constitution. It's an affirmation of certain principles of the American Constitution. Same thing. The law of Moses is a detailed covenant, a detailed law code of 613 commandments. And the 10 commandments give you a summation statement, but it's applied to Israel. And people have to notice how often Moses and the prophets says this is a law code given uniquely to Israel, not given to Gentiles, not given to the church, but specifically to the people of Israel. It does not apply to Gentiles, does not apply to the church. And therefore, when you keep these different law codes distinct, then you know what does apply to us today, what does not apply to us today. Like Paul says, we can learn things from the Torah, the law, the nature of God, the nature of sin, a lot of things we can know. And a very important principle from the Torah is that blood is the means of the atonement. In Leviticus 17, verse 11, by means of the shedding of blood was atonement for sin. But in that context, it's always animal blood.
Mm-hmm.
But the law of the Messiah distinct is we don't need to have animal blood shed anymore, because the blood of Messiah has been shed, and that covers all our sins, past, present, and future. It's only applied to those who believe, but it's made available to all who would believe. And so that's the key factor.
Mm-hmm.
We should keep in mind. A lot of people who believe the law of Moses for today never bothered to read it. And no matter how much they say we got to keep the Torah, they have to make many adjustments. None of them are going to keep the animal sacrifices. If the temples rebuild next month, are they going to follow animal sacrifices? Not likely. Though some Messianic Jews told me they would do that, but they're violating a key principle of the book of Hebrews. The final shedding for blood for sin has already been accomplished, and the things of that nature. But and there are so many other commandments of the Torah that people have shoved aside. So in the end, while they claim to be Torah observant, they only observe only certain commandments, and sometimes those commandments that they keep in the wrong manner, like keeping the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They keep the Sabbath in churches that I know of, whether it's Saturday or Sunday, in the biblical pattern.
Yes. And so maybe we can address Arnold. We hear a lot of Christians say, well, the law of Moses, there's a tripartite division. The law of Moses, you have the moral laws, you have the ceremonial laws, you have the civic laws, and so forth. And Jesus abrogated the ceremonial laws. So the kosher laws are gone, animal sacrifices are gone, the feast days are gone, and so forth. But we do have the moral law. And the moral law invariably always comes back to the Decalogue. So maybe we can talk, because this is a very important issue here, where Thomas Aquinas made those distinctions in his theological work, and the reformer John Calvin followed suit as well. And so many today are under the impression that the law of Moses, the moral aspect or the moral law, is still in force, but the ceremonial and the judicial laws have passed. I think this is a very important issue that we need to address.
Let's talk about the ceremonial. First of all, let me mention, New Testament never divides the Torah in those three divisions. These are man-made divisions. And these are man-made divisions for the purpose of trying to divide the Mosaic law. This we keep, this we don't keep, this we keep, we don't keep. But the moral law pre-existed the law of Moses, didn't begin with Moses. Adam broke the moral law way before Moses, and Satan broke the moral law before Adam. He was already a fallen creature when Adam came into being, and so on. So the moral law is moral laws, but they already existed in the previous Torahs, previous law codes, during the Adamic law code, Noahic law code, and so on. So also incorporated into the Mosaic law code. And then later on into the Messianic law code, they'll be again in the kingdom law code in the Messianic kingdom. We talk about the ceremonial law, how do you divide it? For example, is it immoral to marry your sister? It is immoral at the present time. It was not immoral with the first generation of humans.
No.
There's only one man, one woman that produced all the sons and daughters, so people had to marry their sisters. Were they immoral? No, that specific commandment was not yet given. It was given a bit later. What's said is marrying your sister became immoral a bit later. Is it immoral to marry your aunt? Until Moses said so, it was not immoral, because Moses' father married Moses' mother, but the father was the nephew of the mother. So were the parents of Moses immoral? No, that specific moral commandment was not yet given, and so you can do those things.
Right.
Was it immoral to marry two sisters? Until Moses, it was immoral. In Genesis, it was not immoral. So Jacob married two sisters and married two handmaids, and so on, producing the 12 sons of Jacob, the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. So these are so you have different those moral commandments, but even the moral commandments were not always immoral until the specific commandment came into being. So law of Moses, you have these commandments, you didn't have it previously. And you cannot call Jacob or even Abraham being immoral, because they had handmaids to have relations with, to produce seed and so on. They were following the code of Hammurabi of those days, but still there was no law against that during that time. And so you got even they talk about the moral law. The moral law is not exact in all periods of human history. Certain moral commandments came into being as different law codes and different covenants came into being. So if you're going to follow the moral law, you're going to follow the one in Genesis, you can marry two sisters at the same time and things of that nature. And these are things you wouldn't do in present day, but these were not immoral before they came into being in some law code or another law code. And so for Jews today, it's those who choose to follow Moses, it's immoral to eat bacon and ham and things of that nature. But it certainly wasn't immoral before Moses gave you those laws. So every moving thing shall be food for you, no limitations, and those kind of things. So
Right.
these are specifics, and most people just don't bother to take time to read the text in context.
Mm-hmm.
See, because not all commandments are given to all people. So there's certain commandments given to me, and those commandments given to me follow the law of the Messiah. Other commandments I can choose to follow, but they have no spiritual value to me, but still follow them, following certain things out of choice, not because I'm trying to fulfill something. But the 613 commandments will keep you busy for the rest of your moral journey, number one. Even if you choose to follow only the moral commandments, you still have to distinguish the moral commandments now is against the moral commandments under Adam or under Noah and so on, where a lot of things were being done which were not be very immoral, was not even near immoral. But the way Abraham married his half-sister, that is immoral today. It was not immoral when he married Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
That law had not yet been given. So there are moral codes, but not every moral code came into being at the same point of time in human history. As God's revelation was progressive, he revealed more and more. He made certain new rules and regulations. And once the law of Moses was given, you had two different law codes. You had law codes for the Gentiles, like Adamic law code and the regular code. For the Jews, it became the Mosaic law code, not Lord the Messiah. All the law codes are that's the same for all of us now.
Right. Right. And so that tripartite division that you always hear about, the ceremonial, moral, and judicial, is really a conjecture, because
Exactly.
because as you said, Dr. Fruchtenbaum, the word Torah is in the singular in Hebrew, and the Greek nomos. And also, the Apostle Paul didn't think that there were these distinctions. He said in Galatians 5, if you be circumcised, you become a debtor to the whole law. Not just to
Exactly.
parts of it, but to the whole law. It's a package deal. The Torah is a package deal.
It's not
Uh,
10 commandments, 600.
right. It's 613. And in Matthew 5, when people quote Yeshua when he says that not one jot or tittle will pass from the law, but then he said, whoever teaches men to ignore the least of these commandments, he shall be called the least in the kingdom. A lot of people usually skirt through that and don't realize that what Yeshua is saying is that he's talking about the whole Mosaic law. If you play eeny, meeny, miny, mo with the Torah, Jesus is saying you will be the least in the kingdom.
That's correct. That's the key point to make. When he's made that statement, he's speaking to a Jewish community. There's no church yet. There's no Christians yet. He's been to the Jewish community. And what he's defining in that sermon, what they call the Sermon on the Mount, is defining the kind of righteousness the Mosaic law really commanded. Did it command only external conformity, or did it require both external and internal conformity?
Mm.
And that's the key thing we have to understand. And he's addressing the Jewish people, making a contrast between that was already in the Old Testament from the time of Elijah, the difference between the remnant and the non-remnant. Both terms apply to Jews. The non-remnant are the Jews who choose not to believe what God had revealed to Moses and the prophets, and the remnant consists of the Jews who did believe in Moses and the prophets. Nothing in certain amount, he keeps contrasting what he's teaching about the Torah. It is his definition of the righteousness of the Torah. But in contrast to whom? The Pharisees. As you go through those three chapters, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, they say this, I say that. They say that, I say this. He contrasts his interpretation of the true righteousness of the law in contradistinction with the Pharisaic interpretation of the Mosaic law. The only account we have of the full Sermon on the Mount is in Matthew, not Mark or Luke, because Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience. And this is particularly relevant to a Jewish audience. And he's pointing out that what is coming, the remnant will be those who accept him as the Messiah, and the non-remnant will be those who reject him as the Messiah. So the contrast between the remnant and the non-remnant is continuing into New Testament and beyond. And people often miss that was the whole emphasis of the Sermon on the Mount. But he says that I came not to destroy the law, and he didn't. He came to fulfill the law. He's the only Jew who kept it perfectly, and the commandments applicable to him, and so on. But the rule of life of the Mosaic law came to an end with the death of the Messiah. And that's why in Hebrews 7, we now have a new priesthood, no longer the Levitical Aaronic priesthood. We're now under the Messianic law code. And now we have a new high priest. And he could not function if the law of Moses was involved, still a rule of life, because law of Moses, you have to be a Levite, and not just a Levite, you have to be a Levite who was the direct descendant of Aaron to function as a priest. But the Messiah was a Judean. He could not become a priest under the Mosaic law. And that's why the emphasis there is the law of Moses has come to an end. And now we're under a new law, which allows for the Melchizedekian priesthood to function. He's our high priest, and the rest of us who believe, all of us are priests. In the Mosaic law, only a certain line could be priests. The law of the Messiah, every believer is a priest. We don't have to be ordained to the priesthood as some churches practice. The moment we believe, we become priests. Male or female become priests. And therefore, as priests, we should represent people to the Lord.
Yes, and also that's one of the reasons why the kosher laws had to be abrogated as well, because that's what kept Israel distinct from the Gentiles. So that's why Peter was so reluctant in Galatia. Peter was drawing back with James because he didn't want James to think that Peter was eating with the Gentiles, and Paul had to confront him to his face, as he says. I stood up to Peter. So as long as the Mosaic law was in effect, and I know you made this before, Arnold, this point that in Ephesians 2, Paul calls it the wall of partition that kept the Gentiles out. And so the Messiah had to break down that wall to bring together both the Jews and the Gentiles into one new man.
One body, and the one body is the body of the Messiah, the Keilah, the ecclesia, the church. Exactly right.
Right. And so just when we think about this subject of the law of Moses, as you know, Arnold, this has opened the door, a Pandora's box to, there's a lot of cults out there today, Sabbatarian cults. You mentioned the Seventh-day Adventists. We also have the Armstrong cults, the Armstrongite cults.
Correct.
We have the Hebrew Roots movement, which has appeared in the past 10, 15 years or so, which is bringing all these Gentiles under the law and so forth. And there are also, as you pointed out, there are also Messianic movements that just because they're called Messianic, people simply assume, well, they're legit, but some of them deny the deity of the Messiah, like Joe Good, I believe, is one of them.
Exactly.
And also a lot of these Messianic communities try to bring the Gentiles under the law. In other words, they're basically saying, if you really want to worship God, then you should worship the way Yeshua worshiped God. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I want our hearers to understand that just because a group claims to be Messianic doesn't necessarily mean that they're orthodox or biblical.
No, unfortunately, the term Messianic has never been clearly defined in the Messianic movement. That's a sad shortage. And because they call themselves Messianic does not make them kosher. That's the good Jewish way. If it's Messianic, maybe it's kosher, maybe it's not kosher. You have to understand, what are they teaching, what are they claiming, and so on. And so it's important to make that distinction. So we call ourselves Messianic, but we define ourselves to be biblically Messianic. We know what law code we're under. We know what different rules of the Mosaic law code we're free to follow, free not to follow, and things of that nature. But we identify ourselves as being Messianic and Jewish, but we do not make rabbinic tradition as our operative function. We make the Bible as our operative function. And that's one of my distinctiveness for us among other Messianic congregations around the world. Sadly, of the many Messianic congregations we have here in North America, I would say only 25% are solid Bible teaching. In Israel, they're probably less percentage of solid Bible teaching. And that's very, very sad. At least Israel now has a very solid Bible school, the Bible School of Israel Bible College, I think is what the technical name for that. And that's the only solid Bible school in the whole country of Israel at the moment. Hopefully others will crop up, but that's it. In America, we have some others. And one of the reasons Ariel came into being and the Shoshana campus program in upstate New York came into being. We're only 40 miles south of Canada, by the way, so we're very close to Canada. And people didn't have Canadians for the last 2 years because of COVID. But now it's starting to attract them again, and so on. But where people should consider coming into our campus during the summertime, where they come for 1 week or 8.5 weeks. They can learn a lot of this kind of solid Bible teaching, not just from me, but other Messianic Jewish leaders who also have that same understanding.
Right, right. And so, again, those of you who may be interested, ariel.org, there's information there on the Shoshana camps. So I would highly encourage you to check that out. It's very, very educational. And just one more thing, Arnold, when we were talking about the Mosaic Law, and of course the claim that the Sabbath transferred to Sunday, which has zero biblical support whatsoever. The only day of the week that was given this special name was the seventh day, and I think the only other day called Shabbat was the Yom Kippur, because it was the most sacred day of the Hebrew calendar. Other than that, the other days are referred by different names in Hebrew. But when we talk about the Sabbath as a creation ordinance, and they go to Genesis 2:2-3, that God rested on the seventh day and he blessed the seventh day, he hallowed the seventh day, and so forth. Maybe talk towards that, Arnold, because a lot of folks seem to think that God established Sabbath observance in Eden.
Well, he didn't establish it in Eden per se. He never told Adam to spend 1 day a week resting and so on. He just tells us there what God did. The word Shabbat itself is not found in Genesis at all.
Right.
The root is there, meaning used as a verb, that on this day he rested. That's not the same as observing Shabbat. And so from Adam until Moses, you have no record of anyone ever keeping the Sabbath. Not a single time, nowhere in Genesis. Never in the history of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and Joseph is anyone keeping the Sabbath. And until you get to chapter 16 of Exodus, and then make it a Torah law in Exodus 20, that's when keeping the Sabbath became mandated. And again, limited to Jews because it's a sign of the Jewish Mosaic covenant. Even the Gentiles were not obligated to keep the Sabbath, only Jews were obligated to keep the Sabbath. We have to keep reminding people, if you're going to keep the Sabbath biblically, then you have to read the Bible, and that will tell you how to keep the Sabbath. Most of you are not keeping the Sabbath, and most of you are actually breaking the Sabbath when you're thinking you're keeping the Sabbath.
Mm.
So Sabbath became a rule only till then, but you don't find the Sabbath observance. And Genesis is a long book with 50 chapters. Never once is keeping Sabbath mentioned. You go into Exodus, the Sabbath is not mentioned until Exodus 16. The fact that so many people quickly broke the Sabbath shows they were not used to keeping the Sabbath. That was the first time they were given the Sabbath commandment, not to gather these certain things for eating and things of that nature.
Mm. Mm.
So there's a lot of confusion about the Sabbath, but the Sabbath began strictly on Exodus 16, and there's a law in Exodus 20.
Mm.
We have a book called the Shabbat, the Sabbath, from Ariel Ministries. It's a paperback. It covers every single verse where the Sabbath is mentioned, and also every rule. Those are applicable to the Sabbath biblically, and they can get that from our home office, or here on the campus, they can get it as well, and things of that nature. And that then they will learn what it means to keep the Sabbath, and helps clarify exactly why the Sabbath is not mentioned in the Lord the Messiah at all. It wasn't intended for that purpose.
Right. In Exodus 16, it's interesting that the Lord has to teach Israel which day is the Sabbath, that the manna would fall on every day, but on Friday, the sixth day, there'd be a double portion because you're not supposed to pick it on the seventh day. So, and so you have to ask the question, well, if they always kept the Sabbath, there's no reason why God had to teach them the Sabbath. And then in Nehemiah 9, where we read there that Ezra prayed that how the Lord came on Mount Sinai and you made your Sabbath known to your people.
Exactly.
He made it known to them. And so God had to reveal it to them. But what would you say, Arnold, when some Sabbatarians would say, aha, but in the book of Acts, Paul went on the Sabbath, he went 3 Sabbaths in a row to the synagogue to preach. And so he gathered with his Jewish brethren on the Sabbath. How would you respond to those who bring that up?
Well, he didn't go to the synagogue for corporate worship on the Sabbath. He went to the synagogues to evangelize.
Right.
The doors were open for evangelism. It's not open today for evangelism, but in his day, you can go to any synagogue and present the gospel until there was no objections to it. But he didn't go to the Sabbath for the purpose of observing a Sabbath ritual. It was very clear. He always went to the synagogue to present the gospel. So for him, this was evangelism, not worship,
Right.
and so on. But then those Gentile Jews who believed, and the Gentiles who believed, he organized them into a local church, stay with them to teach the whole counsel of God, train people to be elders and to be deacons, and then move on to a new city where it begins the process all over again. That's what he was doing.
Right.
So that was the policy of going to the synagogue. If you want to follow this example, don't go to church on the Sabbath. Go to synagogue on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And see if you can go behind the podium and preach the gospel. It's not going to happen.
No. And I guess with, in the first century, where do you find a whole bunch of Jews gathered together at one time? Well, it's on the Sabbath. And so Paul took advantage of, going on Shabbat to meet with his kinsmen to give them the gospel of Yeshua.
One situation where he was going to, the city did not have a synagogue because the community was not strong enough or rich enough to have a synagogue. So what he does, it says he stayed several days in the town. He could have gone ahead and preached the gospel to Gentiles. In the meantime, he doesn't do that because he follows Romans 1:16 very carefully to the Jew first. So he waited until the Sabbath came, and the rule was that if you have no synagogue, then you go to the water source of that city, be it a river or a spring or whatever. And that's where you have your Shabbat service. You not to the river, which was the water source for that city. And the Jews who were there gathered together, and he went there, again, not to have a co-worship in the synagogue sense, but to give them the gospel of the Messiah. It was evangelistic again.
Right.
And so he followed to the Jew first very carefully.
Right. Right. Well, it's interesting. One of my friends on social media was telling me that he got into a bit of a debate with another Christian brother who was actually insinuating that that stoning should be practiced today because of God's moral laws and so forth and so on. And I encouraged him to watch our program tonight, which I think he is watching. But this is where it goes, Arnold, that these are the excesses, the extremes that people go to when they simply assume that Torah law is still in place, that stoning adulterers. But then again, if you really want to get legalistic, as you said, then you should stone people for breaking the Sabbath.
Exactly.
And so it always comes back to a matter of consistency. And that's what we see in these movements is there's just this lack of consistency. They simply play eeny, meeny, miny, mo with the Torah.
If you have a situation where a man on the Sabbath went out and gathered some wood, and they weren't sure what they should do about it, God told them he broke the Sabbath, he needs to be stoned to death. He was stoned to death for gathering wood.
Mm-hmm.
This guy might have applied it to fornication, but the Torah goes beyond fornication. he doing something like gathering wood for the Sabbath, well, you get stoned to death.
Yeah. Yeah. And also when the Sabbath officially ended, the Mosaic law, which would include the Sabbath, it ends with the death of the Messiah. And so Romans 10:4 that Messiah is the end of the law to all who believe. And so when Messiah died, when Jesus dies on the cross, the Sabbath and the entire legal Torah comes to an end. And the tearing of the veil in the temple, I think, would also signify that the barrier between God and people is now opened with
Exactly.
the piercing of the Messiah's body.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Right. And so the new covenant then, and Hebrews uses that legal language about a testament, a covenant only comes into force when the testator dies. When much like today, when someone leaves a living will and testament, it only can be probated if that person has died, and then it takes force. And so, would you say, Arnold, that the new covenant came into effect with the death of the Messiah? Would it be the death of the Messiah or the death and his resurrection?
Well, include the resurrection, because the resurrection was the evidence that he really was the Messiah, so his death had a meaning. But you have a transitional period in the book of Acts as it transitions in different aspects from law to grace. But the actual completion, but for the general public to get that understanding didn't come right away. Even Peter did not fully understand that until Acts chapter 10, when
Yes.
he said, go ahead and these Gentiles are not circumcised, but go ahead and preach the gospel to them anyway, because until then, the only Gentiles that came to faith were those who were previously converted to Judaism and underwent circumcision. So there were proselytes saved in Acts 2, Gentile converts to Judaism. But now for the first time, he's actually told by God himself, go to the house of Cornelius, give them the gospel, which he did. He stayed with them, even at the same table with them, which was also a no-no. And the next chapter, in chapter 11, is back to Jerusalem, and guess who attacks him? The members of his own congregation, because he sat down and ate with Gentiles who were not circumcised. And so it took a while for them to understand this new age, this new law code, this new way of life. And so the book of Acts is a book strongly on these kind of transitions.
Right.
Go
Right.
from law to grace.
Right. And I think the first time I met you, Arnold, I was very concerned about the fact that that many Messianic movements or congregations were committing the Galatian heresy, where the Apostle Paul warned in Galatians about those who would pervert the gospel, and if anyone brings any other gospel other than the one you've received, let them be anathema. Very strong. I guess in Hebrew it would be the word devoted to destruction. It would be the equivalent of the Greek anathema. And do you find today, Arnold, that Galatian heresy is a recurring problem? And I see it everywhere. It's on social media, in various presumed Messianic movements, where it's always this idea that you need to be Jewish in order to worship God and have a relationship with Yeshua.
Well, most often the Jews throughout the history of the Hebrew Bible didn't practice correctly, and they felt having little idols at home was not a problem. Well, it was a problem, and things of that nature. Even sacrificing outside of Jerusalem in the high places, that was a problem, and so on.
Mm.
So you don't have to be Jewish; you just have to be biblical. And biblical requires you to study the text as it is, in context as it is. Because you can pull any verse out of the Bible and make it mean what you want it to mean, but you keep it in the context where it is found, then you're stuck. It means what it means in that context, and no other meaning than what's meet in that context. And so context is everything,
Right.
and so on. And so there's a lot of confusion about the law of Moses. There was a lot, like there was a time when the dispensational style teaching was stronger. And when that discipline was stronger, people understood the difference. But now I think it's gotten blurred between replacement theology, wanting back to the church fathers or to Calvin or whatever. They don't really understand. People have lost that understanding. And so when they say, we uncall, you have those who claim to keep the whole Torah, we're not doing it very well. Those who want to keep just the moral law. But again, which moral laws? Those that come before Moses or those that come after Moses and things of that nature?
Right.
And the Mormonism began with multiple wives. They're going back to a situation that did exist earlier, but no longer.
Right. Right. Well, what we'll do at this time, Arnold, is because I'm mindful of your time. Well, we can take some questions from our viewers. We have some questions here, so you're okay with that, Arnold?
Sure.
If we take some questions. Okay, so we do have a question here from Aaron Fisher. What law is Isaiah referencing that will go out from Zion in Isaiah chapter 2? In Isaiah chapter 2, verse 3, is it the Mosaic law or the law of Christ?
Actually, it's dealing with in the context with the Messianic kingdom, and they're under a new law code, which would be the kingdom law code. And the details of the kingdom law code are found in different prophets. Most all the laws of the kingdom is going to be from Ezekiel chapter 40 through Ezekiel chapter 48. In those last 9 chapters, but you have it. So the context of this Isaiah 2 verse 3 passage is neither the law of Moses nor the law of the Messiah, be Messianic kingdom law. And again, we'll have certain commandments repeated, certain commandments discontinued, and certain commandments brand new, never seen before. So it'll be neither the law of Moses, not the law of the Messiah. It's going to be the law of the kingdom. It'll be distinctives. In the law of Moses, for example, Gentiles could not go into the inner court. But in this context, even Gentiles are going to be allowed to enter the inner court of the temple compound because it's a different law code. They're not allowed to do this in the Mosaic law. There's no temple right now, and when the temple is built for the Messianic kingdom, then there will be specific law codes followed, and that's one of them. But in the question, he allows us two options: Mosaic law or law of Messiah. It's neither one. It's kingdom law.
Yeah, and the rabbis, one of the reasons why the rabbis had difficulty with Ezekiel in terms of canonicity was they understood that Ezekiel, the laws that Ezekiel was talking about, were very different than Moses. And so that was one of the consternation of the rabbis when it came to Ezekiel.
All the few laws in Ezekiel are contradicting the Mosaic law.
Yes,
And they
yes.
have a lot of heart. They tried to find a way to verify everything.
Yeah, yeah.
And the Talmud tells the story of one specific rabbi who burned many barrels of oil trying to rectify everything, and he finally did and was accepted the Hebrew canon. But that Talmudic passage never tells us how he did it. How did he rectify all these contradictions? We have no knowledge of how he did it, but he got a lot of credit for doing it. We don't know how he did it.
Right, right. Another one from Aaron Fisher. Will the Gentiles be held accountable to the law that's written on the heart and not the written law that was to Israel in regards to Romans chapter 3, verse 19 to 20?
Well, they were because the law of Moses was not their rule of life. That was not what they're being held to. What they'll be held to is the law code of the Adamic and the Noahic law codes, and that's what they'll be held accountable. So if they stand before the judgment seat and they're told, asked, "Why should we let you into heaven or let you into the kingdom, whichever?" Then whatever law code they choose to follow, whether it's the law code of the heart or the law code of this Adamic, Noahic, or later Mosaic for the Jews, he'll show they failed in all those realms. So in chapter 1 of Romans, from verse 18 till the end of the first chapter, he deals with the pagan law code, pagan Gentiles, and they have failed to follow the law of their conscience. And then he deals with the cultured Gentile society, like the Greeks and the Romans, or whatever standards they claim to follow, he'll show them to be failures. And then from chapter 2, verse 16 till chapter 3, verse 10 of Romans, he'll turn to the Jewish question. And if any Jewish person says, "I kept the Mosaic law," God can show he's also failed to keep the Mosaic law. So in the end, we have all fallen short of the righteousness of God. All of us, pagan Gentiles, cultured Gentiles, Orthodox Jews, we have all failed. And that's why God had to institute his own salvation program, which will provide a blood atonement once and for all, which will be the atonement of the Messiah.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, Aaron has a lot of questions today. I already have the book Israel's Only Hope, the New Covenant. Is there another book in the works by your friend John Metzger regarding the Abrahamic covenant?
I don't know. There's a special volume. What he's dealing with is putting out an Ariel study Bible, which obviously will deal with all of these covenants because it's going to be a Messianic Jewish study Bible. It's going to be a while before it comes out because we're dealing with the whole Bible and not a specific subject per se. But so he will definitely, I just read roughly the manuscripts, so he definitely deals with the Abrahamic covenant intensively in Genesis and elsewhere. And he also deals with the other covenants that God made, 5 Jewish covenants, and he made and all 5 are dealt with extensively in Scripture. And when Study Bible comes out, it'll cover everything.
Okay, another one from Aaron. Are Christians to apply the Mosaic law in regards to civil government? For example, is the death penalty required for a rapist during this dispensation, the church age?
Well, that was required for Jews under the Mosaic law. And the Mosaic law did not apply to civil governments of any other government than the Jewish government, the Israeli government. So it would not be applicable, for example, to other societies. And certainly raping a woman of any age should be severely punished, but how far the punishment goes, then each human government can determine that, because the law of Moses, governmental laws, do not apply to Gentile governments, only to the Jewish government. The Jewish government, stoning was the pattern, but that was not applicable to others. Another example is the issue of idolatry, that the Jews were finally sent into Babylonian captivity because of idolatry. And the two major sins, the idolatry factor and the failure to keep the sabbatical years, that determined the length of the captivity, 70 years. And so that's, but what kind of country was Babylon? It was the center of idolatry, rampant idolatry, with many gods and goddesses, temples, and everything else. So he sent the Jews who were guilty of idolatry into the heartland, the center of idolatry, and they lived there for 70 years, and by then they got sick of it. Idolatry ceased to be, a rare exception, there are some rare exceptions, but largely it ceased to be an issue for the Jewish people when they came back from Babylon. But he didn't judge Babylon for their idolatry, or Assyria for their idolatry. He judged only Israel for their idolatry, because that is the covenant people. The Assyrians, Babylonians, Greeks, Romans, none of them were the covenant people, only Israel.
We have a very interesting question here, Arnold, and very related to our topic on theonomy. What are both of your thoughts on theonomy? Seems to have a big outspoken following online Reformed community. What is the best way to address this topic?
Well, there's nothing in theonomy on the issue of dealing with God and theos and law nomos. Again, we have to get our criteria limited to the text of Scripture. In some of the theonomy movements, especially among the postmillennialists and so on, they believe that the church should function as the government and carry out governmental issues, but the church is to be in submission to the government. The only time we can disobey the government is they ask us to do anything that would be a non-biblical or anti-biblical. So once the Nazi government took over its anti-Semitic policies, that's when true believers had to resist and move away. Not that they pick up guns and kill people, but they have to be willing to suffer the consequences as believers. And if that meant their death, they would have to suffer their death, and many did suffer their death that were not even Jews. And so it should be kept in mind that the theonomy, which is part of one segment of the Reformed community, only one segment, they want to apply biblical laws given to the government run by the church. And the church has not been a good example of how to run an organized entity over the centuries. That's why we got over more than 1,000 different denominations, if not more.
Right.
But the issue here is to whom is the laws given to Israel? And the enemy wants the church to be the government. And that's why they tend to be post-mill. They'll conquer the world, rule the world for a long time. And so the second coming will be only after the millennium, not before or in between. But you cannot apply the standards of government given to Israel, which was a theocracy, to other nations. And that's the factor of theonomy.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. So I was asked as well, what are my thoughts? The same reasons that Dr. Fruchtenbaum gave, that a lot of theonomists today are basing their arguments on the Mosaic covenant. And so they go back to those penal codes in the Mosaic covenant, all of which have ended. They're no longer enforced. And that's why I asked Dr. Fruchtenbaum to come on to talk about this subject, because there's so much confusion between the law of Moses and the law of Christ. The law of Christ does not call Christians to run the government. We are called to, yes, submit to the government, obey the government unless they violate God's commands in the new covenant. And we pray for God's kingdom to come. And we know that the Lord Jesus will return. We know that he will establish his kingdom. And so theonomy is rooted in this Mosaic covenant. And that Mosaic covenant is no longer enforced. It's no longer operative. And therefore, all these penal codes and so forth, the punishment for murder predates the Mosaic covenant. So Genesis 9, whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. And personally, I don't know where you stand on this, Arnold, but I think that the punishment for death, for murder being death, I don't think was ever rescinded. I think the New Testament shows support for that. And even the Apostle Paul said, if I've done anything deserving of death, I do not refuse to die. But when it comes to adultery and idolatry, 1 Corinthians 5, there's a man there who's having a sexual affair with his stepmother. The apostle could have said, stone him to death according to the law of Moses, but he doesn't. He says, excommunicate him, kick him out of the church, hand him over to Satan. And so Paul would not be a good theonomist, because if Paul was a good theonomist, he would say, have this guy stoned to death. But on the contrary, he says, hand him over to Satan, so that his body will be destroyed and his spirit saved on the day of Christ. Did you want to add to that, Arnold?
I think you said it right. That's also my position, that you cannot allow a theocracy that Israel was. And the prophets and others and kings and so on was his agent from a theocracy until theocracy collapsed with the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. So that is the criteria. But what they're trying to do, as much as they can, is applying these elements to the church and so on. The church, that I would not accept the church as being a function for the government. And when I read in the text, we should be in submission to the government, even if it's a Roman government. And that was not a democracy. That was an autocracy. We didn't have real democracies until sometime later.
Right.
You can have different types of governments, but they have no authority to function as a theocracy. And therefore, you cannot apply these rules. And Israel was a theocracy. And they've lost their theocracy with the fall into by Babylon. That's when the times of Gentiles began. There's not been a Davidic king on the throne since the removal of King Zedekiah.
Right. So we have a question from Brenda. When Jesus said the two commandments he gave, I think she meant he gave depend on all the law and the prophets. Exactly what did he mean in light of tonight's discussion?
Well, what he said, and then are we talking about Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 20? Is that the passage that we're talking about?
I think it's the two great commandments, Matthew 22.
Well, again, the two greatest commandments, because I brought that up because people say the 10 commandments are enforced, but not the others. Well, the first important commandment, the second most important, were not among the 10 commandments. And so to love God with your whole being, heart, mind, soul, and so on, and love your neighbor as yourself. Those were principles that were part of the Mosaic law, rules of the Mosaic law, and according to the Messiah, these were the most important rules of the Mosaic law. But why, if the 10 Commandments are so unique and special, why weren't those two commandments among the 10 Commandments? They were not. Mm-hmm. So that's why you have to treat the whole Mosaic law as a unit, 613 commandments, and so on. And the 613 is not among the 10 Commandments, which he says were the two most important, but among two other commandments in the Mosaic law outside the 10 Commandments were the two most important commandments.
Which have also come into the law of Christ as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. Question from Leon: is it okay to say that we shouldn't do things that were prohibited in the law, not because it's the law, but specifically on the grounds that God called them abominations, like Deuteronomy 18:9-14?
Well, the term abomination is used in a lot of different ways, including eating the wrong kind of meat. But it was not an abomination for Gentiles to eat those things, only an abomination for Jews to eat those things, because they violated the law God intended for the Jewish people, intended for the people of Israel. So again, our law code is not the law of Moses. We need to follow the law of the Messiah. Now, we're free to keep kosher. And for my first years as a believer, I kept strictly kosher. Slowly, I realized my freedom in the Messiah. So I still don't eat a lot of non-kosher things, but I'm not all that strict about it, and so on. But our law code is now the law of the Messiah, and that's the law code we're obligated. And we're going to be judged not by how well we keep the law of Moses. We're going to be judged at the judgment seat of the Messiah by how well we keep the law of the Messiah. And that's going to determine whether it's wood, hay, stubble, or gold, silver, precious stone. And that's how the rewards will be meted out, and that's also the way in which we're going to develop our position in the Messianic kingdom. All believers go in the Messianic kingdom. Not all believers will receive honor and glory and positions and authority in the kingdom. So how we live now will matter for 1,000 years, but at the same time, it's going to be based upon the law of the Messiah, not the law of Moses. Now, I'm not against people keeping the law of Moses if they're neutral issues as far as the New Testament is concerned. But many of the commandments, law of Moses, are not neutral, and therefore we have to be more careful about those. Like the example I gave earlier, I don't need to check a person if he's circumcised, a Gentile if he's circumcised, when I invite him over to a Passover table. And yes, I keep the Passover. I keep the Passover, exercising my freedom in the Messiah. I'm not claiming to keep it the way Moses said, because I'm keeping it in the wrong place and in the wrong way.
Mm-hmm. Crusader for Christ, off topic, what is your view of double predestination? I have heard you believe 3 points of Calvinism. Thank you.
It's not 3 points. I hold to 4 points of Calvinism. I don't hold to limited atonement. And on a couple of other points, I wouldn't necessarily define them. It's the way Reformed theology refines them. And like total depravity and things of that nature. So Calvinism is something I wouldn't teach off the cuff. I would teach it in the classroom structure and look at every passage, because it tends to raise more heat than light as you teach this kind of a subject. But I'm basically a 4-point Calvinist, but I don't necessarily define the 2 or 3 other points in the very same way as Reformed theology, and it's certainly never held to double predestination. But before humanity was even created, God already predestined who's going to heaven, who's going to hell. That's double predestination. And I never held that view.
Okay. Well, thank you, Crusader for Christ, for your super chat there. We have a question from Truth Defenders. Off topic, Mr. Arnold writes on the giants in the land as not being giant in stature. Can you speak on that a bit? I like his position on it.
Well, King James is the one that rendered the Hebrew word as giants. But the Hebrew word for giants is the word anakim. That word is not found in Genesis 6. The word is found is the Nephilim, which from the root means to fall. So what we have in Genesis 6, verses 1 through 6, is how certain fallen angels, so angels appear, they always appeared as young men. Satan had made them intermarry with human women, producing a race of people that were known as the Nephilim, and the most other renderings today calls it Nephilim, not giants. The reason giants came into the King James Version is because in Greek mythology and Roman mythology, you had gods or goddesses intermingling with humans and producing children, and they were called in Greek gigantes. And our English word giants comes from the Greek word gigantes, but didn't mean big people. It meant that these are people that would be very hard to kill, but they always had one weak spot, like Achilles had a weak spot in his heel. And so when the arrow was shot into his heel, that's when he fell and was able to be conquered and so on. And so following that pattern, it didn't mean big people. It just meant exceptionally good soldiers and so on, but they had a weakness somewhere in their body. And the Nephilim were people who were birthed by human women and fallen angels, and the product was neither human nor angelic, but they could not reproduce themselves. What we read in Genesis 6 is Satan's answer to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. You have the very first messianic prophecy. I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. That prophecy of the Messiah for the first time was not given to Adam, not even given to Eve. It was addressed directly to Satan. So now Satan knows a descendant of the woman he tempted will someday come to defeat him. What he tries to do in Genesis 6 is to pervert the human race so they cease to be productive. Let me give you a more biological example. If you cross a horse and a mule, a horse and a donkey, you get a mule. Now, if you want to produce more mules, you cannot, there's no male or female mules. You have to keep crossing horses and donkeys. If you keep doing that, eventually the horses disappear and the donkeys disappear. All you have is mules, and they'll disappear when they die because they can't reproduce themselves. So Nephilim were a race of people that could not reproduce themselves. They're able to promote sinfulness and adult, not all kinds of sins and so on of that nature. And so that was Satan's tactic. And he came very close to succeeding, but it wasn't just that there were two seeds of Adam at that point, Cain and Abel. There were many seeds of Adam, because it says in Genesis 5, they had many sons and many daughters. And so of all these other lines, only one was preserved from this intermarriage. That's the line spelled out in Genesis chapter 10. And as a result, they're the ones who, the family of that line, which was the Noah, his three sons and their wives, were preserved by the ark, and the whole world was perished by the flood. And this way, humanity was preserved and began to reproduce more humans. And by the same token, that's the way God overshadowed what Satan was trying to do. And so all of us are descendants not only of Adam and Eve, all of us here are descendants of Noah and his wife.
Right. Question here. Have you read The Limits of Orthodox Theology, Modern Orthodox, Mark Shapiro? The chapter on the externality of the Torah alone is worth getting the book.
I've not read that specific book, so I cannot pass any judgment on it one way or the other. So I cannot say anything about the book per se. We talk about Jews for Jesus, which was a Messianic organization. This is, it points out, a goy for Jesus. There's nothing wrong with that term either. For exactly what he means by the limits of Orthodox theology and so on, I have to read the book, and I cannot comment on something I haven't read.
Right. Question about by going for Jesus. So the Noahitic covenant would still be in effect?
The Noahic covenant is ongoing, and the Adamic covenant is ongoing, with the certain limitations of the subsequent covenants. For example, in the Noahic covenant, the death penalty was only mandated for premeditated murder. And in the Mosaic covenant, murder was one, but also cursing parents, cursing God, and practicing witchcraft, breaking the Sabbath, and so on is also punishable by the death penalty. And but with the law of the Messiah, what we're under now is that we live in different types of governments, and the governments can determine for which sins or crimes they will issue the death penalty. But what should not be compromised is a death penalty for premeditated murder. We don't have to carry out the death penalty in civil governments by any other sin except this one. And therefore, that's where it has to be limited, because it's an ongoing covenant. And the Mosaic covenant as a unit was based upon Israel being a theocracy, which came to an end. So now we're all living under civil government. Even Israel, with a Jewish government, it's mostly secular anyway. There are Orthodox Jews in the government, but they're a small minority within the government. And so they basically ruled out practicing death penalty, except in one case, which was with Eichmann's case, when he was punished by hanging, and then ashes thrown spread throughout the ocean, and so on. But I would say with the Noahic covenant, Israel made a mistake by not carrying out the death penalty with the premeditated murder, but they had the authority to not carry out the death penalty and in any other way than that one. They had the authority to do so, or to do not so, but they chose not to do it. But the Noahic covenant is ongoing, and therefore I say death penalty should still be continued with the issue of capital punishment with the issue of premeditated murder, and I would not remove that. In the U.S., many states have removed it. California has taken it away. Texas has not taken it away.
Bless you.
But the Noahic covenant is ongoing, and that should still be in effect. We shouldn't try to carry out the death penalty if the evidence is not there fully, like such circumstantial evidence and so on. But if there's a clear evidence of premeditated murder, undoubted, then the death penalty should be in effect.
Right. Just a couple more questions, Arnold. I don't want to hold you up too long. So we have a question from Bible Care and Share Fellowship, Michael. Dr. Arnold, have you ever had the chance to debate or converse with anti-missionary Rabbi Tovia Singer?
Not with Rabbi Tovia Singer, never have. There was years ago, I did a TV debate with another rabbi who represented Reconstructionism, which is a very liberal branch of Judaism. So it wasn't all that difficult. But I've never had a debate with Tovia Singer. Others have. There's a man, there's a Messianic Jew that I think has been actively debating him, and so on. The name slips my mind at the moment, but and I've seen some of the products, and he does a very good job of it. But I have never personally done it.
Okay. This is an important question related to our topic, Le Apologite. What is Dr. Fruchtenbaum's interpretive exegesis of 1 Timothy 1:8? And Arnold, it says here, 1 Timothy 1:8, now we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and the disobedient and the ungodly and so forth. So I guess he's wondering what law is that?
Well, the way he puts it, it could be the Mosaic law, but and if so, there's still things we can learn from the laws I mentioned earlier. There's a lot. Leviticus is not something we practice very well, but we can learn a lot of the principles of the book of Leviticus. We also might be referring to just general law, that you have the law of the conscience, not the laws the Bible mentions, and therefore these are for the purpose of condemning those who fall. I don't take any hard position whether it's the Mosaic or the any other law code, but I would say that the principles he pulls out of it would be true of different law codes at different points of time.
Right. Okay. And on this question, Arnold, I think it's fair to say that you would agree that the Sabbath rest of Hebrews 4 is the finished work of the Messiah. It's not referring to the seventh day. He goes back to Genesis 2, and he speaks of that rest that we've entered into in the Messiah. So that Hebrews 4 is not Sabbatarian, but that it says that we have entered into Christ, and therefore we rest in the Messiah.
The two times the writer of Hebrews mentions the Sabbath, uses this typologically. Then in the present time we've entered into the Sabbath rest, and ultimately we shall enter into the Messianic kingdom rest, and which will be the millennial kingdom, Messianic kingdom. So he uses it typologically, not literally. Like you mentioned earlier, the word Shabbat is only used of the seventh day of the week, with the exception of Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. There's also the sabbatical year and the year of Jubilee, but those are not days of Sabbaths. Those are either yearly Sabbath or every 50-year Sabbath.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So maybe two more questions and we're going to be done, Arnold. I know that you're a busy man, so I don't want to hold you up. Dr. Fruchtenbaum, could you please speak a little about the dangers of replacement theology as seen on the pages of history?
Well, my dissertation for New York University, which I got my Ph.D. from, was called Israelology. And in the first chapter, I dealt with definition of terms. In chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, I deal with three different schools of replacement theology. In chapters 8 and 9, the differences with dispensational theology. And then in chapter 10, I bring out a segment of dispensational theology called Israelology. All the Bible teaches about Israel, theologically, not historically, but theologically, dealing with so on. So I deal extensively with replacement theology. Recently published a book written by a man from England, and that's a 2-volume. The second volume is dealing more with the rise of Palestinian theology against Israel. But the first is it's the best book I've seen. That's why we chose to publish it. That how replacement theology came into the church in the early times of the 2nd century and how it grew and developed. Even the Reformation that brought out correct doctrines about justification and sanctification never broke away from replacement theology and continued to teach it. And that book is available from Ariel Ministries. But those are the 2 very good books I highly recommend by 2 different men from England. And the first book will be relevant to this specific question on replacement theology. The second book is how many theologians in the liberal churches, Church of England, and so on, have taken on the principles of replacement theology and applies it to the issue of the Israel and the Jewish and Arab conflict and so on. But that book is, both volumes are very helpful, but particularly in this question, the first volume is extremely helpful.
Okay. So we'll take one more question. And folks, if we didn't get to your questions, we apologize. As just that time, our mortal enemy waits for no one. And so we do need to let Dr. Fruchtenbaum get his rest tonight as well. So one more question, Arnold. Is Christianity a Jewish religion into which Gentiles have been called and grafted in, or does it fall under something other?
Is Christianity a Jewish religion? Well, Christianity in its early days followed the principle of Judaism. Many of the things that we have to this day, like local congregations, like the synagogues, they were not denominationally oriented. So you have in many churches denominations. You also have independent churches, but they follow that each independent church is truly independent, and the authority does not lie with one individual or the chief pastor, but it lies with the authority of the elders. The deacons have no authority, but they work under the elders and so on. So you have many churches that reflect what we find in the synagogue, but many others contradict the synagogue practice in other ways, and so on. Even the rabbi is not the final authority of the synagogue. It's the elders of that synagogue that become the final authority. They can fire the rabbi, or they can continue keeping the rabbi, and so on. So I would not say that Christianity is following a Jewish religion. And the Jewish religion has to be defined if we're dealing with Judaism. To follow a Judaism, a religion that began in the intertestamental period. If you read the whole Hebrew Bible with 4,000 years of human history, you never read about Pharisees or Sadducees, no synagogues, nothing like that. You go to the Gospels, there are Sadducees, there are Pharisees, there are Essenes, there are Zealots, there are synagogues everywhere. So in the intertestamental period, Judaism changed radically. And that's why you have to talk about what kind of Judaism. You had Sadducean Judaism, Essene Judaism. These are all different Judaism. So there was some denominationalism developed and things of that nature in the Judaism. And sadly, Christianity also follows certain denominations, not based upon what does the Bible say, but what's the church tradition say. So Judaism developed more in traditional Judaism, Pharisaism in particular, now Orthodox Judaism. And Christianity also followed traditionalism more than what the Bible teaches. So you had developments of baby baptism, hoping they'll save the baby that way. You had other different things, sprinkling and pouring and so on. But in the baptism, that was a practice of the Jews long before it was a practice of the church. And we always, as Jews, practiced immersion, never sprinkling, never pouring. So those churches eventually developed into immersion only. That would follow the Jewish pattern. But sprinkling and pouring does not follow the Jewish pattern. And there are myriads of examples of these differences. So a very good question is, a good Jewish question is always, where is it written?
Yeah.
If they go to a passage, then look it up, and then look it up in the context. Where does the paragraph begin and where does it end? Because whatever that statement means, it has to have the meaning based upon the context where it is found.
Mm,
If it's not found there, don't follow it.
yeah. 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 So it's so interesting you said that, Arnold, because many of our Jewish friends today, when they speak of Moses, they would say Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our rabbi. Moses was never called a rabbi. And in fact, the rabbis developed much later, and the synagogue originates, it seems to have originated with Ezra and then developed further in the Second Temple period. But Isaiah never stepped foot in a synagogue. There was no synagogues in Isaiah's time.
Synagogues, anyway, in the Hebrew Bible, that developed in Babylon when they finally moved away from idolatry and began teaching Torah. And they brought the synagogue concept back to the land after the captivity. That's when the synagogues began. They didn't exist, but in Matthew, they're already existing everywhere.
Yeah, yeah. So, folks, I trust that you've been blessed and edified tonight. And I hope you've come to see the distinction between the law of Moses and the law of Christ. They're not the same. The law of Moses has passed. It's been fulfilled. It has been set aside. We are now under a new covenant, a new law, the law of the Messiah. And therefore, the relationship of the believer to the Old Testament law is really null and void. It's that law was given at a specific time to a covenant community, and when the Messiah came, he set aside that law. That is consistent New Testament teaching. And so we hope that this has helped to answer a lot of your questions, a lot of your concerns. As you could see, this is a source of great division, and it's also a source of great false doctrines, and cults have arisen out of this understanding. And so once again, Dr. Fruchtenbaum, thank you so much for taking time away from your busy schedule. I really appreciate your ministry. I appreciate your scholarship, and may the Lord bless you and continue to bless your ministry as we pray that more and more Jewish people come to know their Messiah, and that they will come to have a saving relationship with Yeshua, the Messiah of Israel.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So everyone, thanks again. Please don't forget to subscribe. The channel is absolutely free. Like the video, and God bless you all, and shalom to all of you. And hopefully we'll see you again soon, God willing. Take care. Bye for now.